I'm going to carry on with what I was sharing with you last week. So I need you to put on your thinking caps, and I need you to focus on what the Lord has got to say to us this morning. The theme that I was on last week was for such a time as this. I'm reading through this book of Esther, her story, her life. Actually, this book is not just about Esther. This book's about a guy called Mordecai. And I think the book of Mordecai doesn't sound as good as the book of Esther, because this guy was an incredible human being. So we're going back to about 480 BC. This beautiful young Jewish girl becomes the King Xerxes' queen in a very weird set of circumstances. Esther's cousin, Mordecai, heard the plot to assassinate the king, and he warns the queen. The king is saved. The traitors are hanged, and then this guy comes onto the scene. This guy Haman comes onto the scene, and he becomes the newly elected big cheese in King Xerxes' kingdom. He gets complete reign and rule over King Xerxes' kingdom, and that's exactly what King Xerxes wanted him to do. But this dude, is something wrong with him, because his authority, this position, goes to his head. In brackets, not an uncommon thing. And so he abuses his authority in egotistical power. And he's a proper egomaniac. And he decrees that everyone he walks past must fall on the floor and bow. The king doesn't even do that. So he's like trying to push himself above. The king doesn't know he's doing that, and he decrees that this was happen. And unfortunately for him, there's one guy in the crowd called Mordi who refuses to bow and scrape to Haman, and so Mordecai becomes the target of his hatred. And so Haman sets out to destroy Mordecai, his family, everything the Jews stand for, and every Jew in the kingdom of Xerxes. And basically, what Haman was planning was the genocide of the Jewish people in that specific region at that time. And so Mordi hears this, and he's on death row. He has one call to make, and guess what call he makes? He calls Esther, his cousin. And he calls, I don't think he just calls for help. I think at that moment God uses that call to call out destiny in Esther. Sometimes there's situations in our lives that we don't fully understand, and I think that's most of our lives. We just go with the flow, and then something happens, and God intervenes in a strange way, and we think it's like the next step in what we must be doing in life. But are we aware that destiny is woven into the fabric of our existence, and destiny has been placed on our lives for such a time as this? And this was that moment where Mordecai is pleading on his behalf. He didn't care if he lived or died. He knew God. Why would you worry if you lived or died, if you knew God, the living God? But he was concerned about all the innocent Jews who'd be wiped out, and there would never be a history, a story told about their lives. But he knew the God he served was a God of promise, and God had promised that he'd always look after his people. So he thought, maybe this is the time. Let me call Esther. Called out destiny in this young woman's life. And Esther is afraid. She puts on her brave, and she dares to walk into the presence of her husband, the king, where only people could enter his presence if he raised the golden scepter, even his wife. But she took a chance. You know, you take chances when you're walking in destiny. You step into spaces you would never normally step into when you're stepping into the destiny that God has woven into your life. She started seeing the God-given purpose of her life unravel. And Mordecai and the Jews were saved and rescued. And Mordi was honored by the king. And Haman was exposed. And then he was disposed. And King Xerxes then makes Mordecai the big cheese of his kingdom. Think about that. That's destiny. A nobody. 2 cousins in a city at the right time. 480 BC. Wow. And then something happens. And 2 people step into what God has for them. And the world around them radically changes. And the Jews rejoice in the freedom and in their new leader. And at that, Mordecai institutes the Feast of Purim, which basically is it's a holiday where the Jews joyfully celebrate their victory, their freedom from the disaster that was going to happen to them through Haman. So let me ask this question this morning. What happens when it comes to destiny and our God-given purpose in our lives? What do we do with it? How do we step into destiny? Great question. Is this the right time, in the right place for you? Have you stepped into what God has destined for you? Or are you just happy to just go with the punches? Just live an ordinary life? And then sign off one day, and they chisel it on your tombstone. I don't know if they do that anymore. He lived an ordinary life. No one will visit that stone because it's an ordinary stone with an ordinary saying. But what happens if somebody wrote on your tombstone, that person lived an extraordinary life? That person was a person of destiny. They fulfilled their God-given purpose of life. How do you and I step into our destiny and stay there? What a great question to ask. Someone said this. And they said this about following Jesus. I love this saying, and it's so helpful for all of us. Following Jesus is long obedience in the same direction. Think about it. Following Jesus is long obedience in the same direction. So I'm going to give us some pointers that I think can help us step into and stay in our destiny. You ready to go? Number 1, simply obey God. Simply obey God and His commands. Long obedience in the same direction. You know, choices are ours to make. I've mentioned this again because I think it's worth mentioning. You and I have been entrusted with choice. Your choice is your choice. No one can make choices for you. And our reality is that each one of us are just one decision away from making a good or bad choice. Each one of us. Choose right. The Bible tells us, encourages us, like He did God's people throughout the ages. Choose life. Choose between life and death. Choose between blessing and curse. Oh, that you would choose life, that you might live, you and the generations to come. Choose life. God's going all out and He's saying, I'm giving you choice, but I'm going to give you a hint. Choose me. Don't choose curse. Choose blessing. Don't choose death. Choose life. Make decisions that will enable you to enter into those spaces in life and living. And I believe that it's the path we take, the journey that we're on, each one of us. I don't know where you're at. My assumption and my hope and my desire is that you're on a good walk with Jesus. Our path we take, the journey that we are on, determines how you and I make decisions. So like the old hymn says, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Obey God. In the warm winter, in the warm summers of your life, obey God. Obey God in the cold, chilly winters of our lives. Obey God. God's command is very simple. Love Him wholeheartedly. Be devoted to Him. Nothing to the left, nothing to the right, but wholehearted devotion to Jesus. Following Him straight down the middle. That's a simple thing. You want to walk into your destiny? You want to stay in your destiny? You want to have someone write something great about you on your tombstone? Obey God. Here's the first commandment. Love Him with all your heart. Don't go to the left. Don't go to the right. Be completely devoted to Him. Lukewarm is not an option. It's a compromise. In between goes nowhere. Here's another command. Love one another. Obey God. Simply obey God. Love one another. Not like one another. Love one another. I'm not meant to like you. I'm meant to love you. I'm a Jesus follower. I'm meant to push past all that social rubbish and love you the way God wants me to love you, because you deserve the love of God. I need to love, obey the command of God. Not prefer you because you like me. I'm meant to love you regardless. I'm meant to love you. And here's the great news. You have to love me. I love that part. Oh Lord, that they continue to obey you. You see, obedience is all in. And the result of our obedience is not up to us. I don't obey God to get results. You don't obey God to get results. The results of obedience are the Lord's. Just obey Him. But it's so difficult, I know, but obey Him and see what happens. Because we know how to disobey God, and we can see what happens. Swing it around. Let's obey Him. Simple obedience. Simply obey God and His commands. You know, we serve a living God. We serve a God who is alive. He's not a time machine who slots in and out according to us, to our needs. God is alive, and He is to be worshipped for who He is, not according to the image we want to make God. And the one thing we can be assured, and this is the hard thing, I'm saying this, it's very hard for me, and you can go and look on, there's I think he's a Christian hip-hop artist. His name is Toby Mac. And he wrote a song, and some of the lyrics go like this. God is never early. God is never late. God is always on time. That part I don't like about obedience. I don't like it when God is not on time for me. When He is always late. Or He's just too early and then I'm not ready. But obedience isn't about that. We obey, full stop. Obedience is radical faith. And the radical faith that we have in Him has far-reaching results, far beyond anything we could imagine. Esther and Mordecai would never imagined their lives would work out like that. The impact on their obedience saved a people for generations to come. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people impacted through that simple act of faith and obedience. And we just got to remember that Jesus never tells us about tomorrow. That's the uncomfortable thing about following God. But what He does do, He promises to be with us tomorrow. He's not going to plot it out for us, but He promises to be with us. And here's what faith is about. Faith and obedience are first cousins. Faith is believing that what Jesus has said is enough. Faith is believing that what Jesus has said is enough. What has God said to you? What has He said? That is enough. Faith is keeping in step with the uncompromising abilities of God. God will do things that we will never be able to understand. Faith believes in that stuff. We step into that stuff. I do believe God honors obedience. I do believe that. I'm not one who says God's going to promote you. There is a bit of a weird theology about that. God's going to promote you. I get that. But here's the deal. Mordecai was promoted. So it's not really what I think, hey. I do believe God honors obedience. Your simple faith. God can do something that you would never expect. Just see what He will do. The second thing I want to say is hold to your convictions. Hold to your convictions. And I mentioned this last week, and I think I should just say it again. Conviction is built through courage, putting on your brave every day. Conviction is resolve. It's refusing to be distracted from the destiny and purposes that God has for you. You see those people, they've got like fire in their eyes. When you speak to them, there's something about what they say. When you watch them, they've got energy in their bodies. They have resolve. They have deep conviction. They won't be swayed to the left or the right. And we put on our brave because God strengthens us to put on our brave. Even when we're afraid. Do you remember Peter, when Jesus came walking on the water? Do you remember that moment? We all go, hey, that would have been cool. I would have been terrified. I would have jumped out the boat. People walking on the water is not a common scene. Jesus walks on the water and Peter's afraid. So here's the weird thing. He starts off afraid as Jesus walks towards him. And then he gets out the boat when Jesus says, come to me, Peter. He gets out the boat. So he was afraid. He puts on his brave. Jesus said, gets out the boat. He said, oh, Jesus is calling me. I'll get out the boat. He walks to Jesus. You know the story, hey. He looks down and he goes, I'm afraid. So he gets scared, and then Jesus grabs him. That's a true story for all of us. It's not always straight line, is it? Sometimes we're scared, then we put on our brave, and next minute we look around and we're scared again. But I love Jesus. But here's the thing, when Jesus calls you, you must understand He's got you. It doesn't matter if you sink or stand. He's got you. That's what we need to hold on to, is this space. Put on our brave. It doesn't matter. Hold to your convictions. There are going to be moments in our lives where we're going to have to do that. Hold to your convictions. Let me just mention this other aspect to staying in your destiny. It's got really nothing to do with the story, but as I was thinking about this and praying about this series this week, I felt the Lord talk to me about setting boundaries. Set boundaries for your lives. Let me just add this in, and you'll see how it weaves into every part of our lives. It's so easy to be pushed or to push other people into uncomfortable spaces in lives. Think about you, your relationships with the people around you. Think about your work situation. Think about your role in your work situation. Think about the person who you work for. Think about your school, your classroom. Think about your peers. Think about the decisions you want to hold on to. Think about your convictions. Think about your desire to be obedient to the Lord. Think about all those things. It is so easy to be pushed into uncomfortable spaces. And you know, we're afraid that if we set boundaries in our lives, people will get upset with us. Boundaries aren't meant to keep people out. Barriers do that. Boundaries aren't meant to keep people out of our lives. They are meant to keep us safe and sane. That's what boundaries are for. It's not really about us and them. Boundaries aren't about us and them. Boundaries are about our well-being. Boundaries are defined by what matters to us. What matters to us? Boundaries are defined by our main things, by our non-negotiables. What are your non-negotiables? Young people, what are your non-negotiables? So let's call it out. What about sexual purity? As a Jesus follower, that's something you would go, I want to embrace sexual purity in my life. What happens if somebody comes along and starts pushing that boundary? If you don't have a boundary, you're going to push and you're going to be called a pushover. But you see, we set these boundaries in our lives so that we can be whole and that we can hold on to the things that we value most. That's what boundaries are for. What about a parent and a child? What happens if you don't have boundaries as a parent? Then your child just runs around like a freaking Scud missile, blowing up everything. We set boundaries, what for? For our safety, for our sanity, so that the child can grow up well. What about a work environment? This is the tricky part. What about a work environment? Or what about a school classroom? What happens in those spaces where you don't have boundaries for your lives, and then someone comes along and they ask you to do something that is contrary to what you believe in? Awkward. Every one of us have had to deal with that. If we don't have boundaries in our lives, then it becomes awkward for us. You see, I think boundaries generally are, when they are set, they're things that are well thought through. They're there for a specific reason. They allow for meaningful relationship. They allow for growth. They allow for healthy communication. They allow for conflict resolution. Do you know that no, the word no, N-O, has always been and may still be understood in a negative light? Has always, the first word that Caleb learned, no. We call him Mr. No-No. Now he's in the snow. So now the no is not allowed to know. No is such a word we use in the wrong spaces of our lives. However, if we have clearly defined boundaries, those boundaries help us to say no to the things that we need to say no to, and yes to the things we need to say yes to. I believe Mordecai was one of those guys. He had boundaries. When Haman walked through the village and everyone was falling around down on the floor, Mordecai was the only guy standing up. He had a boundary. I'm not going to be pushed into some awkward space in my life. I'm going to say no to the thing I believe I should say no to. I'm going to say yes to the thing I believe I should say yes to, even if it costs me. There is a price to everything we make. There's a price to every decision we make, every choice we make. That's what boundaries are for. When we feel our boundaries being pushed, what we need to do is we need to meet the boundary pushers at the boundary line and start honest conversations so that we can start understanding each other. Barriers are different. You step over this barrier, I'm going to knock you out. And I don't have to explain myself. In fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump over my barrier and sort you out because you're too close. There's no space for relationship when we put barriers up. But boundaries are very helpful for healthy relationship. We come to the person and we come to our boundary and we start a conversation so we can explain to people who we are and what we stand for. You see, Mordecai was able because he had boundaries. King Xerxes had this dream about him. What has happened? How come this guy's name is recorded in these books? And Esther said, because he's the guy who told on about the traders. He's the guy who saved your life. You see, this is what boundaries do. I want to see that guy. I need to have a conversation with him. That's what boundaries do. One man made a choice. I'm going to put a boundary around my life. And it changed the whole kingdom. It's an incredible thing. If people can't, let me just bump this. If people can't accept our boundaries and keep pushing, the chances are very small that we'll end up having a meaningful relationship with that person. Very small. If people keep pushing. Youngsters, if someone in a relationship keeps pushing, I want this out of you, keeps pushing, the chances are you're never going to have a meaningful relationship with that person. Parents, if your child keeps pushing, the chances are, if you don't get clear about your boundaries, the chances are there'll be an unhealthy relationship developing between you and your child. Boundaries are very helpful for communication. We must use them for that. My last thought on boundaries is this. Boundaries aren't just for others. To make sure that our lives are okay. Boundaries are very much for us. They help us live well. they help us live well. They help us make great choices. They help us have healthier relationship with other people. My last thought this morning, I want to share with you about our destiny, staying in your destiny. Beware of viridatus. Now, I'm not Latin, so I can't say it properly. Viridatus. Beware of the weeds. Beware of the weeds. So Leon and I out in our garden the other day in the heat, and we're pulling out this invading weed. We'd never seen it before. We saw these little things on little Harvey's legs, but we didn't know that those things came from the park and were dropped off in our garden. And all of a sudden, one of the patches of our grass was just a different color green. So we were down. Leon was pulling out the weeds. I joined her. It's quite addictive pulling out weeds, I must tell you. And we started pulling out this weed, and I started realizing how complicated this weed was. Because here's the sneaky weed. This weed was so clever, Trevor. What it did, it put its root next to the grass root. Sneaky chap, eh? And then it ran a line underneath the grass thingamajig. Just underneath, you couldn't see it. Just giving off its little flower things all over the place. So I didn't know this. I just hacked a weed. When I pulled a leaf off, I saw like a leaf move further up. I'm going, you're kidding me. I dug below the grass. I found this weed, stringy-majig. And I pulled it, and the leaf came to me, 0.5 meter, all through the grass. I thought, you sneaky little weed. Then I tried to pull the root out. There's lots of grass patch missing, I must be honest. But that root was so deep. I pulled out a root, I kid you not, of the weed that was this long. And it kept putting down roots. So this made me think a lot. I thought, wow, what a great sermon to preach. And then I realized Jesus spoke a lot about this. Then I thought about Nahum. And I sort of shouted out in my imagination, Nahum. No, wrong guy. Haman. Beware of the weeds. Then I shouted at myself, Brett, beware of the weeds in your life. Pay attention to what's going on. We have to be aware of viriditas. We have to be aware that there are weeds. First and foremost, let me say this. God has our best interests at heart. And His desire is for your life to be fruitful. One. Secondly, Jesus openly talks about weeds. It's in the book. And He warns us, watch out. Because before you know it, weeds will take over. Sometimes without you even knowing. Thirdly, pay attention to yourself. We need to start pulling the weeds out of our lives before they take over our lives. You know, like most people, like most people who own grass, lawn, it's easier to go, they're just weeds, I'll mow them over. It's easier. And that's what most of us do. We cut them when the crop is cut. And you know the other thing about weeds, their flowers are so pretty. Little green ones, little red ones, and mauve ones, and yellow ones. They're so pretty. You thought, well, prettier than grass, because most of my grass is brown. And the leaves of the weeds never go brown. They're always green. So the grass, well, I only just keep the weeds. It looks green. I've had a good discussion with Ross about this. He said, just leave this stuff. So I'm in sort of conflict over this. But I will say this. Haman didn't pay attention to the weeds in his life. He never paid attention to his inner life. Life for him was lovely and green, but the roots of his weeds were deep. And when he got bumped, it was very evident that something was wrong in his life. Do you know that the first two parables that Jesus teaches, he mentions weeds? Matthew chapter 5, 6 and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 8, 9, 10 and 11, Jesus displays the power of the kingdom. Chapter 13 of Matthew, Jesus teaches about the kingdom. The first parable, Jesus mentions weeds. How weird is that? How weird is that? Hammond, watch out for the weeds in your life, because they are there. And you know what Jesus said? When the seed is sown, it lands on various paths, and the one seed lands amongst the weeds, and the weeds choke the life out of it. And Jesus says, that's what worry and the cares of the world do to our lives. Watch out for the weed of anxiety. Anyone here over anxious? Watch out for that weed, because it can kill you. Watch out for the other weed, the worry of the world, the need to have more. I don't know if we want to put it in the bracket of greed, but watch out for that weed, because it'll throttle the life out of us. And Jesus goes into the next parable and he talks about a weed that is sown with the crop. And then the guy comes and said, but Jesus, look, the weeds are growing up. And Jesus says this, then why don't you just cut down the crop and take the weeds out? There's going to come a time when we're going to have to deal with the weeds in our life, bundle them and burn them. And I'm going to say that for all of us. There has to be a time when we're going to do that. Bundle and burn the weeds in our lives so that we can flourish, that our lives will be full of all that God has for us. If you and I want to stay in the sweet spot of destiny and fulfill our God-given purpose in life and living, we need to hold on to our convictions, simply obey God. I would suggest set boundaries and then watch out for the weeds before they take over in our lives. Done. Destiny is yours. Let's pray. You want to stand?